This is very exciting. Hi, this is Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. In this episode, the tables are turned a bit, and the people from Bosch CyberCompare interviewed me about ICS security, my career, digital bond, S4, and other things. I think you'll like it. Before we get to the interview, though, I wanted to just hit two quick things on S4, the call for presentations and the basic sponsor. Now, the call for presentations is open. It opened up on June 1st and is open through August 15th. We're getting a lot of great sessions in. We've accepted some already. What I wanted to tell you about this is maybe the biggest mistake we're seeing, and if you're going to submit, which I encourage you to do, please avoid this, is we'll get someone that maybe will send in 4 or 5 paragraphs about what they want to talk about. And the first 4 paragraphs will explain the situation in the industry. And then the last paragraph will say, and we'll tell you what we're going to do about it. Really, those first 4 paragraphs are not that interesting to the S4 attendee and make it hard for us to make a decision. It's not that they're wrong. They're just not telling us what's new and important about what you're going to say. So if you're going to send us a submission, the most important thing, again, is to nail down what is new and important that you're going to present to the advanced ICS security professional. So just think about that when you submit. Now, I know a lot of you are not sponsors, but I thought you might find this interesting as well. We're doing something different this year with the basic sponsors. These are the people that have a cabana at the cabana sessions, one of the smaller 9x9 cabanas. We looked at how this went in previous years, and we relooked at everything with our no limits theme, basically taking away any restrictions we had. And we said, what can we do in every aspect to make the event better for our attendees? And one of the things we saw was at the cabana sessions, the sponsors were heavily weighted to the detection space. For example, our large cabana session sponsors, 3 of the 4 were Clarity, Dragos, and Nozomi. All fine companies, but all showing pretty much the same thing. And then we had a smattering of other detection companies throughout the basic sponsor, smaller cabanas. So what we decided to do this year is we've got 5 basic sponsor slots. 3 are paid and 2 are free. And in the month of July, we're going to be accepting applications to fill one of those spots. And what we really want to do is we want to figure out what would best improve the attendee experience. What would attendees learn the most from? What would help attendees create the future? And we'll select the 5 best. Now, these we'll be looking at what's new, what's important, what's different than what's already being displayed at the cabana session, so that the attendee has a wide breadth of things that they can look at and learn from. I think you heard me say, though, and I meant it, that 3 are paid and 2 are free. We wanted to include 2 free sponsorships because maybe it's a startup that doesn't have any money, or maybe it's an industry group or an academic or anyone. So anyone can get one of those free basic sponsor slots if they have the thing that will best improve the attendee experience. So again, these are going to be available. We're going to be accepting applications for these July 1st through 31st. And then after the 31st, we'll take a week or two. So by August 15th, we'll tell the 5 winners who they are. And then obviously we'll put those up on the site as well, so you see who we selected, which might be interesting to you. So if you want to, go to s4xevents.com after July 1st. You'll see where you can apply. Or, of course, you can always email us at s4@digitalbond.com. I almost forgot our own email address there, s4@digitalbond.com. And with that, now let's go to my interview with the folks from Bosch CyberCompare.
Once again, really thanks a lot for being here with us. So it's really an honor to have you with us today. And
my pleasure.
I'm probably not doing you justice, but I think you now have about 37 years of experience in all kinds of security-related matters, right? So having started your career path at the NSA, if I understand correctly, and you're now supporting the industrial security community for, I think, for more than 20 years, right? So maybe, I think many of our audience know you and also fans of your podcast, for example, reading your weekly newsletter. But can you maybe share some of the most memorable moments of your career with our audience?
Well, it has been a long time, 37 years, but I would say most of the memorable moments, things that just happened lucky that I stumbled upon. I tend to find things that I'm interested in and jump into them whether it makes business sense or not. So, for example, when I went to school at University of Illinois and was graduating back in 1984 with a finance degree, and I was going to be an actuary, someone who determined insurance rates. But I had read this article that the State Department, what most of the world calls the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, had a really interesting test to be a diplomat. So I went to sign up to take that test because that sounded like more fun than being an actuary. And they said, no, you're too late. That's closed. But by the way, this other government agency called the National Security Agency, NSA, is coming, and they have a test. Do you want to take that one? And back in 84, no one really knew who NSA was. So I, shrugged my shoulders and said, sure. And I took the test, and it ended up I scored high to be a cryptanalyst, that I had skills to be a code breaker. After that, I got a job offer, and remember, this was 84, and my dad said, what are you going to do with that skill set? No one cares about security. This is a dead-end job. You have this actuary thing. It's a sure thing. You should do that, not that. But I just said, oh, this sounds like fun. It sounds interesting. And I did it. Things worked out. And obviously, security became a big field, and it worked out for me. And the same thing sort of happened with ICS. In 2000, we were a small company, 4 people doing consulting, security consulting, and some water utility out in the western United States contacted us for some reason, I still don't know why, and said, can you do an assessment of our SCADA system? I had no idea what SCADA was. We needed the business. So being a normal consultant, I said, sure. And we ended up competing against IBM and somehow won the contract. And I went out there and I just fell in love with the field. I mean, instead of being in a data center, we were out looking at pumping stations and canals and things like that. I just decided, oh, this is what I want to do. And again, back in 2000, there wasn't much of a future for ICS security. No one really cared about it. I was surprised these people even cared about it. But I just stumbled in there. So I won't say that it's always been successful. I've stumbled into things like banking security, which I really didn't like. In the late 90s, we tried to develop a product for internet brokerages that flopped. But I would say just doing things that I really enjoy and find interesting has led to a lot of the highlights.
That's fascinating. And maybe I'm deviating from our script here, right, if you agree. But what are maybe some of the mentors, some of your mentors or some of the people that you're really grateful for on your journey that you've met?
That's kind of tough because there weren't a lot of people doing what I do. A lot of times it was sort of trailblazing. Most of my mentors weren't actually people, but they were more books and speakers and concepts. So for example, when I wanted to get in ICS security, I leaned heavily on Tom Peters, who at the time was one of the first people pushing this brand you concept. And he talked about how do you develop a personal brand. So when I was trying to get into ICS security, I literally got his Brand You 50 book, and there were 50 things you could do, and you pick some of them, and that's how you make your name in this field. So people like that were more kind of who I led from or who helped me out along the way.
So what was one of the, if at all, right, but what was one of the most difficult technical challenges which you encountered in your field? And maybe also, what were the steps? How did you or your team address these?
Well, if you're talking pure technical, probably the hardest thing we did that was hardest to overcome was we got a contract back in 2006 from the Department of Homeland Security, a research contract to develop the first intrusion detection signatures for ICS protocols. Some of the protocols like DNP3 and Ethernet IP required preprocessors. snort preprocessors to deal with the packets that came in not in one packet, but were split between multiple packets and were involved in multiple levels of the stack. It was something that Snort was designed to do, but you had to build a preprocessor for it. So I hired a really smart guy, Daniel Peck, and he banged away at this problem for a month or two and just could not solve it. We were on the hook to deliver it as part of one of the deliverables to the Department of Homeland Security. And we tried and we failed. And then we finally we said, well, let's get someone who has written one of the most complex preprocessors on board. So we hired him as a consultant. And the first thing he told us was, oh, all the documentation is wrong. So, and this was true even years after this. I don't know if it's right now, but even into like 2011, 2012, it was just wrong. So if you did exactly what they said, it would fail. But this guy said, no, this is how it really works. And Daniel finished it within a week. So that was specific. But I think, what might be more interesting for the audience is one of the real technical challenges now is and this is true every asset owner we go into, is we've got limited resources. We've got a ton of things we can do. Where do we put our resources? Where do we get them? And the criteria I always use is efficient risk reduction. Where do we get the most risk reduction for the next dollar we spend or euro we spend or hour we spend on this? I find that to be a very interesting problem, and it usually bends people's minds a little bit because a lot of times it's not the things that they would think. It usually is something else, and that's a challenge at every company.
Mm-hmm. We're basically having the same discussion with almost all of our customers, right? Because we also think it's the right way to do this. What are some of the, I'm also deviating here again, right? So, what are some of the unique approaches, right, which you use to define risk, for example, together with your customers?
I think the key, and the good news is we're seeing a lot more of this. The key is you really have to focus on consequence. A lot of times we get stuck in this good security practice world where we say we need to do this, and it's not that they're bad things. Certainly in a perfect world you would follow all good security practice, but if I've got so many things to do, the real key is to say, if I implement this good security practice, do I actually reduce my risk? And the only way you can understand that is if you understand the consequence of an attack. And would this reduce either the likelihood or the consequence? And we're seeing now from INL, for example, their consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering methodology. They have a book out on this that is focused on the consequence side. We're seeing cyber PHAs, cyber process hazards analysis, adding cyber to that concept. So I think the industry is finally coming to grips with that. But I really think the key is to understand your consequence and then really understand if this good practice that you're thinking about putting in place will actually do anything.
And to set priorities based on this.
Mm-hmm. I mean, literally, this was funny, and I recommend any consultant do this. This was something that a client recommended for us to do back in about 2008, and we've done it ever since, is they said, I want you to give me the top 5 things in priority order that I should do in the next 1 to 6 months, and then in the next 6 to 18 months. And that really focuses the thinking. You can only say 5. They have to be achievable in that time frame, and you have to determine what your priority is. And we've used for our priority efficient risk reduction. But that's really gone over well, not only in terms of how it's accepted, but also then you go back 2 years later and you see the progress they made, and it's the teams deserve all the credit for achieving it, but it's very fulfilling to see that something actually happened from your work.
It's very actionable, right? If you make it clear what should be the top priority.
Right.
And it also, addresses the reality of many of our customers or in the audience, right? That the budget simply is too limited to do everything that would be nice to have, right?
Well, it's too limited in some cases, and in some cases, it's just not possible. Given the age of the system, given the technology that the system is running on, the constraints that you have add some difficult challenges to the decision. which also is what makes the field so interesting.
Right. So maybe if you're talking about the field, right, what kind of current developments, also technical developments or other developments in industrial cybersecurity do you find interesting?
Well, this is what I do. This is so much. I probably spend a half to 2/3 of my time now on the S4 event, which is looking for those sorts of things, looking for the bleeding edge, what's going to come in the future. Our tagline is even create the future, or for my content, my show or my articles, I probably only spend about 1/3 of my time consulting now. So I'm always hunting for this. So I could give you a long list, but I think for your audience, I think what's most interesting is the new security developments around level 1. Your PLCs, your controllers, your RTUs, both what's becoming available now and what we're going to see in the next 1 to 3 years. Because if you think about this, as I just said, one of the real challenges in securing your system is if the bad guys, if the adversaries are inside the perimeter, they can go straight to level 1. If they have the engineering and automation skills, they don't need to compromise anything else because those systems are, the term we've used for years is insecure by design. Everything you want is a documented feature. You want to upload new firmware? Find the upload firmware command. If you want to change the program, the recipe, find the command to do that. You don't need to hack anything. So finally getting past that is going to make a major difference in this ability to protect your system. What we're seeing now is some of the leading vendors now are actually offering signed firmware. That's just huge. So you get away from this thing we saw in Ukraine and is so easy and actually happens in the lab if you play around with these things. If you upload firmware, you can brick the device if you don't do it right. Bad guys just create bad firmware, upload it. So if you could only upload signed firmware from the vendor, that's huge. Secure boot is related to that. Those are things that can be put in place now for a lot of systems. And we're starting to see encrypted and authenticated protocols. So Modbus secure SIP. I'm not sure, you probably know better than I do, but I thought I read somewhere that Profinet is now talking about being wrapped in TLS. I think there's an effort underway to do that. So we're finally seeing those, which is really exciting. So that's short term. Longer term, what I'm even more excited about is the idea of virtualizing level 1. So everything but the I/O being virtual. And once you get to that point, now you can tear those down, put them up in minutes rather than months. And that just changes the whole ballgame. For all the reason virtualization is so powerful on computers, the same thing is true on these level 1 devices, which are basically computers. And we've seen that. Emerson, for example, has an Ovation controller that's virtualized. I don't think much of it yet because I think they did it primarily for customers that can't afford the hardware. But eventually when it becomes done for security, reliability, maintainability reasons and performance reasons, then you're going to see those actually be the way to go. Just like, I don't know if you're seeing it in Germany, but in the US, most of the larger control systems that are deployed now are on virtual platforms at level 2. And that's going to move to level 1.
I'm not sure if that's the right question to ask here, right? But many of our customers are, of course, approaching us with questions on, cloud connectivity and how to do this in a secure way. So what are your thoughts on this, right? What is the best way to do this? What are affordable ways to do this? If a general answer is possible, right?
Well, this is actually where I'm spending so much of my time now. I had a long call the other day, yesterday or the day before with AWS. I had a call with one of the ICS security vendors that is putting together a cloud service. I think the best way to look at this, and I'll have to give full credit to Brian Owen. He gave a session, if you want to link to it, at our on-ramp event back in 2019 on cloud. And he broke it down into 2 ways. He broke it down into open loop and closed loop, because this would be a way for the automation world to understand it. So he says open loop cloud services, you basically send data to the cloud. they process it, and they don't send it back to the control system. Maybe you look at it through their web portal. Maybe they send you periodic reports or something like that. Maybe they get you on the phone. For Openloop cloud services, it's really straightforward. You just deploy a one-way device, a data diode, a unidirectional gateway. And the good news is the prices on those are going way down. Those were really expensive for a long time, hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy one with a few protocols. But now I think I saw one that was $1,000 for a small installation now. So you're seeing Bayshore, Owl, other people's push the price point down. And I think one of the things you'll see then is it's a no-brainer. You say, I want these cloud services. I want predictive maintenance, efficiency studies, things like that. I want these cloud services. I don't want any risk to the integrity or availability of my control system. Simple. Put in one of these one-way devices. It's done. So that one's real easy. Where it gets tougher is the closed loop. So now imagine that you want the cloud service provider to send either information or commands back to your control system. And this is where I don't think I've seen yet a good solution. I think I know what the solution should be, but I haven't seen anyone do it yet. What we need to see is, if you look at like AWS or Azure, they have these edge devices that will control the communication to the cloud, the authentication, the encryption, the rights to the cloud and such. And you definitely need an edge device. I'm really amazed at the number of people offering these closed loop cloud services without edge devices today. They're essentially going server to server VPNs. And they're saying, trust us. So that's half the solution. The other half of the solution, but it's in the same edge device, is a deep packet inspection internet or industrial firewall or gateway, something like a Tofino, an mGuard, an OT Fuse. Mission Secure has one. A number of people have these that can actually say, this is what's allowed to come in. We had a client who was getting some service for a boiler in the cloud. The cloud service provider was doing predictive maintenance in the cloud, so it was Openloop. But then they also had the capability to come in, and we're offering the service where they could come in and change the settings, certain settings within a certain range to make the boiler run better without informing the client. They just did this real time. When they saw that it would help to change these settings, they did it. But the cloud service provider essentially said, well, we have a pipe right into your control system, but this is all we'll do. Trust us. Trust us that we won't do anything we're not supposed to do. Trust us that we've never been hacked. And I don't think that's the way to go. But if you put one of these industrial gateways along with green grass or whatever in the edge device, you then can say, okay, cloud service provider, closed loop, this is what you can do. You're allowed to do these things and only these things, and it's enforced at the edge. Now, I would be very hesitant to get closed loop cloud services until the vendor can either show me that they're doing that, or like in the case of the boiler I said, where the end user ended up having to do that themselves. But most end users aren't going to do that. The unfortunate thing, I know I'm rambling a little bit here, but this is important, is that asset owners, so your audience, they need to demand this. They can't, if they live with, hey, cloud service provider, you can do whatever you want on our network through this secure pipe, we trust you. If they allow that, the cloud service provider isn't going to limit themselves. They're going to have to be asked for this. They're going to have to actually say, you can't, I won't buy this service until you do this. And we haven't seen that yet from the asset owners.
But honestly, I think it's a very good structure which you just put out, right? And we're going to make sure to link basically to Brian Owen's contribution there. I guess most of the use cases we have seen so far are actually open loop, right? In this in this framework, right? So where data is uploaded to the cloud, and they are processed, for example, to optimize a process, right? And then this is used to for a new algorithm or so, but this can be done then offline, doesn't need to be in real time, or this feedback loop doesn't need to be closed.
But you can imagine the value of this, especially for things that the worst case, if let's say the setting's wrong, it just runs inefficiently or something like that. And you say, well, why am I why am I paying an operator to sit here and tweak this little thing when it can all be done automatic through machine learning in the cloud, probably better, without someone needing to take breaks and all that sort of thing. There's a lot of value in these services, I believe, in these closed loop services. So I think they're the future. But then again, I would say one of the things I found in my career is that I'm directionally correct, but time-wise, I tend to be a little more optimistic than I should be on the time frame.
So how is your stock market performance?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, David, what are your thoughts on, and I'm sure you have a lot to write on this, what are your current thoughts on OT network monitoring or anomaly detection? I'm not sure that I'm using the right word, in OT. So we know you've done extensive and repeated analyses of these systems, and now I understand you even started also developing your own systems for this.
No.
No? Okay.
No, we did 10 or 15 years before they were financially viable.
Okay. That's what I meant, yeah. And also here, right, so many of our customers actually are mentioning this, right, that they are looking at these systems and would also like to get our perspective on this. So maybe what are your thoughts on them at the moment?
As you said, I've looked at this a lot, and I'm a big fan of the technology. So I think the technology makes sense. I think where most people are having trouble with it is they are either using it for the wrong purpose, and even more often they're putting it in before they're ready. So you need to do this at the right point in your program's maturity. So in terms of using it for the right purpose, a lot of the early sales of this technology it was originally built as a detection product, but people were using it to get an asset inventory. Because they had no asset inventory, they had old spreadsheets. One of these vendors would come in, hook into the span port on a switch, and all of a sudden see all these things. And the asset owner said, wow, I've never had that. This is great. This is what I need. But it's really not an asset inventory, asset management product. If that's what you want, you should really buy a product specifically for that. In Germany, you've got your Langner OT base, PAS in the United States, Tripwire. Even some of the vulnerability management companies like Tenable now bought Indige, and they have this capability. But you want something that will be your single source of truth asset management that preferably even has things like change control and other things like that. These detection products are not that. Now they should connect to your asset management product. So when they see something new on the network, they should send it to the asset management, and the asset management should send information about what they know to the detection product. But make sure, if you're buying a detection product, make sure you're buying it for detection. The timing issue is really important, because if you're not in a position where you can use the product, then why waste your money on it? And we saw this in the enterprise as well. People bought a lot of intrusion detection systems, and they just sat there and no one ever looked at them. For example, if you don't have an incident response capability, then what good is it a detection product? So if you don't have that OT incident response capability in-house or on retainer, don't even bother getting this. Because you could use this product, it could collect data for forensic purposes that could feed the incident response. So that would be the first thing. Then if you do have incident response and you're saying, I'm buying this to monitor the network, do you have the team? Are you willing to spend the resources to actually monitor the network? So I see a lot of people buying these things and they're not really ready for them. And then I guess going all the way back to the beginning of our discussion, is this what you should be doing at this point for efficient risk reduction? Would you be better off with consequence reduction? Would you be better off improving your recovery capability? Would you be better off maybe putting in application whitelisting? There's all these things you could potentially do. Is this what you should be doing next? The problem is, and I'm sure you've run into this, the marketing efforts of these 20-some companies are awesome. I mean, they are out there hitting every executive, every board. So a lot of companies are getting pressure from the top to say, what is our detection strategy? Which product are we buying? And if I'm an asset owner, I want to get ahead of that curve. I want to go to management and say, this is our strategy and we'll be ready for this product at whatever point. It might be today, it might be 3 years from now, before the board comes and says, how come we're not doing this?
Absolutely. And also brings us back to the lower levels of OT. So what is the best way from your point of view to secure field devices, so level 0, level 1 devices? So assuming, of course, that a significant risk reduction could be achieved, right, or can be achieved.
Well, I think we talked about that earlier. I do think it's time where asset owners start looking at where upgrading or replacing level 1 falls. Maybe they had planned to get 15 years out of it and they're 7 years in. Maybe they say at 10 years we look at deploying something with the signed firmware, secure boot, and the secure algorithm. Maybe we actually look at that. Maybe we don't want to be on the bleeding edge and do it today, but maybe we want to do it in 2 years. So that's where you would look at that. Until you get that in place, there's not a lot you can do. I mean, I guess in theory you could put one of these industrial gateways in front of it, but unless you're willing to stop a lot of functionality, you have to let it do the things it's supposed to do. So it's almost like putting a firewall in place and allowing all the bad things through it. What have you really accomplished? I guess the other thing I would look at, and I really don't say this too often, but it's probably true, is, and this goes back to consequence reduction. I'm sure you've run into this. You go into an asset owner and you say, what's the really bad thing that can happen? And they say, well, if this thing gets above this temperature, or if this thing spins this fast, or if we mix these two chemicals together, this bad thing can happen. And a lot of times they'll say, but that can't happen because we have soft interlocks in our PLCs. We have code in there that prevents that from happening. I think if you're not looking to upgrade level 1 to prevent that from being changed, I think you might want to rethink how effective that will be against a skilled attacker. And maybe you put in some unhackable controls so that this can't happen. So maybe you don't rely on those soft interlocks because they can be changed.
What would be a good example for an unhackable measure?
One of my favorite stories is we worked with this glass factory, and they had a ControlLogix PLC there, and the scenario was glass factories run at very high heat, and you could turn the heat up to its highest level and then brick the ControlLogix, and they would have no way of turning the heat down. And essentially what would happen would be either the material that makes the glass would become so hot it would melt the whole line, and they actually set these factories up so all that stuff just drops into a pit, in theory safely. But what would really happen is someone would hit the e-stop button, the emergency stop, heat would go off, liquid would turn into solid, you'd ruin the line. So you're talking about tens of millions of dollars and 6-month or more outage because you could brick that PLC. And it's a funny story. Security guys, I'm a security guy. I'm not an engineer. I'm a security guy. Most of the people in the room were security guys. They said, well, maybe we can put in another firewall. Maybe we can do this. Maybe all these application whitelisting, all these security controls. What actually ended up being the solution was putting a crude manual control down on the floor so they could turn the heat down. So they didn't need to use the control system network to turn the heat down, and they could turn it down. They couldn't manufacture product because they didn't have the control levels they needed there, but they could run the material through. They'd have a little bit of waste, a couple of hours while they replaced that PLC or figured out what was going on. And it was about $10,000 to put that in, they estimated. I didn't get the final price on that. And the funny thing is, one of the old timers at the place who had been there for decades said, we had that there. And when we put the ControlLogix in, they said, pull it out. And so things like that, things that controls, and sometimes it's people. You could say, for example, before you press this button, have someone go down to the floor and verify this setting. Verify this is way. So it could be anything like that. There's a number of, and the CCE book does a good job of laying out some of this.
Really interesting. Huh? And then, I don't know what you thought about the question, right? But is it fair to say that unless you're operating like a nuclear power plant or a very special bioweapons lab or whatever, right, that you can probably focus on level 2 and upwards for security measures and patching?
Well, this is where I'm a contrarian. Until you fix level 1, there's not a lot of value in risk reduction in securing level 2. Because if I'm at level 2, I can do whatever I want. So I would focus, and I've got this, you might want to link to it. I have this patching decision tree that's called ICS patch. And it really focuses on exposure. So rather than saying, I'm going to try to secure everything on level 2, I might say, I'm going to secure everything that is accessible from outside the network, from like the ICS DMZ from level 2. Or I might even say, I'm going to segment my engineering workstations and secure them more, but my operator stations are not. So this again goes down to, where do I spend my money? Would I rather spend my time and money patching everything on level 2 every quarter, or would I rather put an application whitelisting? Would I rather do everything on level 2 every quarter, patch it, or would I rather save that up and upgrade level 1? So there's these decisions. But I think a lot of people overestimate what this, and it's a term I hate, what this cyber hygiene at level 2 will actually accomplish. Because in many cases, it gets you very little.
And then maybe related to this, right? So from a security perspective, so which PLC...
Well, maybe let's maybe stay on that just for a second, though. I think one of the interesting things here is this is another reason, I already said it for detection, but this is another reason why you have to get in front of this issue with your executives and boards. Because I've seen many cases where they'll hire a large consulting firm to come in and assess. The board says, I think there's something wrong in OT. Operations hasn't been telling them about the risk and what they're doing with it. They bring in this third party. They run a typical assessment like they would on the enterprise, and they see missing patches, shared accounts, all these things. And then the board comes back and it says these are the things you need to fix. And now it's almost impossible to change the board's mind that that's not where they should be spending the time, because the board hired these people and you had hidden risk from them. You had been basically accepting risk you weren't allowed to accept because you hadn't been informing them of this risk. And now you're stuck with it. So now if you decide patching is the most important thing to you, I might disagree with you, but go to the board and say, this is where our focus is and this is why. But you really need to get in front of this issue, not have it be driven to you top down.
So for PLCs, right, what kind of features do you recommend for automation systems? Which features do you think are really important to improve security?
I think we hit this already. The ones that are easy are the signed firmware and secure boot. And they're easy because sometimes they're just firmware or card upgrades. You don't have to buy a whole new PLC. If you do, it's usually the vendor trying to make money. It's not a difficult feature to add, especially the signed firmware is not a difficult feature to add to the device. And the other nice thing about it is the asset owner doesn't have to do anything, right? This just happens automatically once it's installed. The secure protocols would be the next one, but this then becomes an issue for the asset owner. They now have to deploy certificates on every device. They have to deal with, it's not complicated, but a little bit of public key infrastructure, a little PKI, and it changes maintenance. If a level 1 device, a PLC goes down, they can't just pull one out of the box and put it in. They have to have that certificate pre-installed. So that one takes a little bit more thought and work, but that's probably the next thing. And then the third thing would be going virtual. If I'm an asset owner, I don't know how fast it's going to happen, but I would be looking at that trade-off. I would be looking to say, do I bother with these physical things, or do I just try to get early on in the virtual PLC when that comes around?
So what do you think, what would be the last PLC on Earth that's going to be virtualized? What would this be? What kind of case or what kind of use?
I don't have a good answer for that. I think that's more company-based than anything else. If you ever look at DevOps, there's this myth that longer uptime means something is more reliable. But your reliability is actually going down as your system is up more. And the ability to keep basically refreshing your system, putting a new system up there that hasn't been degraded, that hasn't fallen backwards, is a positive for reliability. And it's a big mind shift. I can't remember her name. This is really bad, but there was a Kelly. I can't remember Kelly's last name, but Kelly gave a great presentation on this at S420 about DevOps and how we need to start thinking about it. It's a big mind shift, and that's one of those ones where I'm probably early. It might be another 5 years, but I would say if you're looking at sectors, the sectors that are less time critical and can take more outages are better candidates because they'll see less perceived risk. So for example, water moves a lot slower than power. So water systems should be early adopters for these cloud services and this sort of thing. Manufacturing that doesn't need to run 3 shifts year round might be better candidates for this. I mean, I'm sure you have a lot of manufacturing there in Germany, and a lot of times they'll say, oh, we have to run all the time, we can never be down. But then if you actually look at how often they're down, they do go down for a variety of reasons, and then they just run a couple extra shifts and they catch up. So those would be good candidates for this.
So most manufacturing businesses, I think they are not refineries, right, where every second counts, or basically you lose output that cannot be recovered anymore, right? That's right. Normally you can catch up later on in most cases.
Right.
And maybe can you tell us about a case, of course without naming names, right, but of a medium-sized business, so not a large utility or whatever, right? So, really a medium-sized business, not a uranium enriching facility or something like this, but really, more related to our audiences. So where you say, hey, it was attacked, but better OT security would maybe have prevented the attack or would have mitigated the consequences of the attack significantly.
I actually think this is an easy answer because what we're seeing is the same issue on most of the exploits that are public. Probably the number one way to stop attacks right now is two-factor authentication for remote access. If you look at how all the public, not all, but almost all the public issues that have come up in the last 3 years, there are people riding in on single-factor authentication remote access. They get on, they get the credentials, they have a anytime way to get in, and they're in there for months planning their attack. I know you probably heard about the Oldsmar water incident in the United States. First of all, it got overblown. It was water, and there was, they had 36 hours and all these other non-cyber ways that they would have prevented it. It's like people worrying that someone's going to dump a barrel of chemicals into a large reservoir, and oh my goodness, it really wasn't an issue. But I thought DHS missed, the U.S. government's Department of Homeland Security missed a major opportunity to just pound that point home there. They should have said, look, there should have been two-factor remote access. This would have stopped this attack. And you can look at Triton, you can look at Ukraine, you can look at all these ways that the bad guys could get in once they had their way in. So that's one. And then the second way, we've seen it is very obvious too. It's removable media. That people don't have a good removable media plan. And that's usually mass market malware. I mean, Stuxnet was a case as well, but that's usually just some mass market malware getting into the system. So those would be the two controls that would stop most of the attacks that we've seen over the last few years.
So I think that many of the pen testers that we talk to also say, right, that two-factor authentication is maybe the most effective measure, if at least one of the most effective measures, absolutely.
Well, when you think about it, it goes back to our level 1 discussion. And this does assume that they've got a good security perimeter, right? That's always the first step to do, is to put in a security perimeter and not fall into that trap of saying, what's everything going between the enterprise and the control system, and let me program that in as the rules. Actually think about what you're letting in and out of the control system. But once you have that in place, we talked about it, once the bad guys are within the perimeter, there's not a lot you can do to stop them. You can detect them, you can recover faster, but if they're smart, they're going to be able to do whatever the system can do. And then it's just their engineering and automation skills that limits them. So it's hard for me to think of a control inside the control system that would stop them, except if it's something that is being connected from the outside. So those jumping points where they come in and then can pivot, those are the ones to really focus on.
Let's say because I think you have a fantastic overview of the market, right? So many CIOs or CISOs that we are in contact with, they tell us they are really swamped by the marketing of cybersecurity providers and consultancies. So what would be your advice on cutting through the noise?
Well, this is a tough question. Advice to who? Advice to the CISO, advice to operations? Who are we talking about?
Advice to vendors and security providers.
Oh, on that side.
But maybe if you have some thoughts on advice to CIOs and CISOs, also very welcome. Very interested.
No. That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. In a sense, I think they're doing a pretty good job, right? They're scaring the heck out of them. They're getting them to buy things oftentimes that are not the right things for them to be buying. Not that they're bad, but they're just not at the right part in their program. So that's interesting. A lot of it just depends on how smart the CISO is. And I would say that, if I was consulting for a vendor that was trying to make an impact, I would say try to go above the CISO, because that's the biggest problem I have. The biggest problem I have is when some board member loves security. And I find it in the boards and sometimes CEOs, there's always one or two people that every time an article comes out on security, or Oldsmar or whatever it is, they want to call up and talk to the security team. And I have been in situations where one of these board members gets a certain feeling that, hey, we need to do this, and hey, this company is really good. And it's really hard for the CISO to stop that. The CISO has a little job preservation to do. They can push back a little bit. They can try to convince. But if a vendor finds that board member that's got something really, a hot urge to scratch an itch, it's going to be tough for the CISO to push back.
So brilliant advice. And then what is a half-truth or a wrong statement, in your opinion, which you still encounter often in ICS security?
Well, I think the cyber hygiene one is the one that bothers me the most. It's a term that means a couple of things. First of all, I think it's misstated. I did a whole podcast on this. It bothered me so much. But when you think about hygiene is what everyone does, right? We all are supposed to wash our hands and wear a mask in these days. And I don't consider patching, hardening a configuration, that's not something that everyone does. That is what an OT security professional does. So I think the term itself is a little wrong. And I also think this mantra that everyone's responsible for security is wrong. If I'm relying on all my people to do the right thing for me to be successful in security, I am going to fail. And I've shown these charts with the seatbelt adoption in the United States, where you just cannot get people, even if it's their own self-interest, even if it's the law, you can't get them all to do the right thing. And look at all the effort it took in safety systems to get us where we are. And we still go through this song and dance on safety, and we still don't get 100%. It would take us decades to get where we are in safety with security. So I would rather see us focus on reducing the burden on the engineers, the technicians, the operators. Really just make them authenticate and tell me if someone is sitting down that you don't recognize at an engineering workstation. Other than that, I want it all to be automated. I don't want to have to rely on them. So that's one part of cyber hygiene. The other part goes back to what we talked a lot about. When you hear cyber hygiene, this is most directly correlated to patching. That patching becomes the most important thing. And if patching is not giving you risk reduction, then I would rather spend my time elsewhere. And we are seeing people measuring cyber hygiene as their key metric. And I think that's just a big mistake. And unfortunately, I don't know if that movement can be stopped. I think that is got a lot of momentum. If you attend any conference, you will hear that over and over again. You'll hear patching over and over again as the most important thing we need to do. I would like to see the CISOs get a little bit smarter on that.
I think in Germany, actually, cyber hygiene, we don't come across that so often, right? Simeon, do you know?
No, it hasn't hit us, but if it's big in the US, it just takes a few weeks and it will be here.
Probably.
Maybe months. We're always a bit behind the trend.
Maybe we can trademark it, cyberhygiene or something like this. Yeah, great.
Maybe you can get ahead of it, though.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the best thing would be to get ahead of
we
it.
heard about cyber immunity on the Hanover Fair, right there. So
Yeah.
maybe final question or close to final question. Let's see. So if you could send an email to all CIOs of the world, what would be the core message or a core message? Or
It would be to focus on risk. Focus on risk. Integrate. Don't treat your OT cyber risk any different than risk in other parts of the company. Integrate it into the same approach. Spend your time and money where it comes to reduce risk, and make sure you're looking at both sides of the risk equation, reducing the likelihood and reducing the consequence.